coming here for years, and it's always a great pleasure to kind of see how things have proceeded, because we very much are seeing a new way of working, a fundamentally new and different way of working forming in our organizations. I do believe things like Enterprise 2.0 and social business are happening, right? We'll even look at some evidence here in just a little bit. What many of you may not know, and I have to use the computer over here to advance my slides, so I'll be walking back and forth. My background in a previous life was being a methodologist, right? And codifying how we do something and how we start doing it and how we sustain it and how do we evolve it over time, right? And codifying it means creating great large, 100-page, multi-100-page binders full of this is what we do and how we're going to do it. And that's very much fallen out of favor because of the way the world is changing, how fast it is changing. And I've driven change into organizations on very large, for example, federal government projects in the United States, where we've had to convince hundreds of system engineers how to change how they think and how they do things that they've spent their entire careers learning how to do. How do you get people to do that? Because one thing I've noticed, one thing I've learned over the years is that people they say they like change, but they actually don't want to change very much, right? It's hard, it takes work, it takes investment. And so when we look at becoming a social enterprise or a next generation organization, we look at how we go about doing that. How can we enlist the organization to actually accept those changes, help us think through those changes and adopt them? We need some plan, some strategy. And so the conversation has come back over and over again through the years. I gave a talk like this 6 years ago at the Enterprise 2.0 conference in the United States. We're now back to having the same conversation, saying we've done this long enough now that we should be able to learn from each other and start driving those lessons into how we apply it. And we can use things like frameworks to describe that, right? Or can we? Or has that process changed so much? So I've done a lot of things, both watched what's happening with social business and Enterprise 2.0 and try to describe it to the world, and I've actually worked a lot with organizations to try and make it happen. So we've come to a place where we have kind of full contact with the social world. Most organizations use social tools, at least in some parts of what they do, right? That could be marketing, it could be customer care, it could be product development, it could be in the workforce, right? Most organizations today, over half of all organizations in the world have social tools for their workforce. We have these things, but are we seeing high levels of performance, right? And I know that Peter has a good point, and that it's not all about performance and efficiency, right? But we are being challenged to produce and describe the results. What are we going to get for doing this new and exciting thing? And one of my favorite pieces of data, which has been, there's many different versions of it now, is this chart here that shows the first wide-scale change and who is seeing the largest benefits from using social tools and new ways of working. And this shows that it's 3,000 organizations and kind of where they are. And most organizations are seeing 1% to 2% organizational-wide improvements. That's actually good enough to justify most of your efforts in most organizations. But some that are doing it, that have completed the process inside or outside, are seeing double-digit benefits, and some, a small number, have completed the process, and they weren't aware they were reporting it, which is why I like this data, they are indeed seeing significantly higher, right, more than this holistic benefit of being a fully networked organization, right? There's been rigorous work saying that there's 1.3 trillion approximately in untapped value in our organizations because we just aren't connecting and engaging with each other very effectively. And that's what we're doing all of this for, is to connect and engage and do things in new and different ways. And the question is, how do we get there? And so we see this. One of the things I see in organizations is that they're doing social business, or Enterprise 2.0, whatever you want to call it, at least twice. Once on the inside and once on the outside. And they're not connected. Right, these are the kinds of things that we can learn if we start studying who is doing this, what happened, and they've done this so many times, and then they have to figure out how to knit all these things together now that they have different tools, different platforms, different policies, different community management teams. How do they make all those pieces fit together? Or is there a better way? And that's the question, have we learned enough yet to do that, right? Because the lesson has been that social engagement is part of a single continuum. And that lesson's been learned so many different ways, the hard way, right? And one of the things we used to hear a lot is saying, I want to do these new and different things, but with everyone, not just inside my company, but everyone we work with our partners, with our customers, with the marketplace. How do we do that? And the organizations, again, to make the point, the organizations that are fully networked with all those constituencies are seeing dramatically higher, competitively significant results to the bottom line, right? Depending on whatever measures you want to use. We've also learned, I don't know why this was, we kind of backed into this because a lot of this change is coming from the consumer world, is that we used to put this off to the side, right? Tack it on to the end, whatever this new thing that we're trying to do with our organizations, and not integrating it how we work. That was another big lesson that we had. And we heard complaints from organizations saying, well, rolling these things out, I'm not seeing high impact. Where's my revolution, right? This is supposed to change everything, but it isn't always doing that, right? And so I was gratified to hear at this conference there's a lot of discussion about how to better connect it to work. We're also being buried in data by these things. Most information in the world, by the way, comes from social channels. The majority of all information in the world, and you can question the value of some of it, of course, comes from social channels. And the same thing should happen inside of organizations. And the thing we began to see a few years ago is people, executives, if they've had social tools in their organization for a while, they began to see that they had too much information. And then a whole process, whole industry developed to start dealing with that problem. How do we deal with that, right? How do we find the value in all of those flows of information? Another difficult lesson we had along the way is that these new things, these new network-centric ways of working are highly asymmetric. And by that, I mean, there's a little bit of us and a whole lot of everyone else on the other side of that network. We're greatly outnumbered, often by many orders of magnitude. How can we engage at that? How can you engage with your millions of customers? How do you even engage with your thousands or tens of thousands of coworkers in a meaningful way? How do you do that? Engaging at scale. We have to create organizational structures and processes that allow us to engage at scale. Or guess what? We won't really get that much value because we're too busy engaging the hard way. Is there easier ways? And if we learn those, can we then broadly adopt them? Right? Because we're getting this now. Now that we've had social technology kind of embedded in everything now, we see what the challenge is that this is wonderful, but now we need to manage it much better. This is where, again, organizational development and frameworks might be able to help. But do we really need blueprints to get there? Right? To make sure that we don't forget what's important, right? This is very new stuff, and I find that we often fall back to what we know, which is the old linear waterfall way of trying to realize anything. And this is much more networked in terms of the way that it changes, right? But I think we all want to leverage everyone's lessons learned. That's why you're here today, right? Is to see what everyone else is doing. How's it going for you, right? What are you doing to make this happen, and how is that working? And learning these really important lessons that we keep forgetting. That one, what makes social business, next generation enterprises special is the network will do the work if we let it, right? We have to give up a little bit of control. But we want to be that conduit, right? And the co-shaper of these wonderful network-centric outcomes that are highly scaled, right? We can do things with communities that we could never do before. Doing things with communities doesn't make them a little bit better. It fundamentally changes them, and you can do things you never could have before. We have lots of evidence of that now. I covered many of those case studies in my book, as we see these very different changes. We want to cultivate and wield social capital in a way that is mutually beneficial for everyone. That's the only way you can get a community to do anything, is because it's mutually beneficial. And so one of the challenges we have with a plan, a blueprint, a framework is because it's the unintended consequences that are often the most interesting outcomes, the things you didn't plan. Can we realize this if we only deliver on what we expected? Right? This is the whole emergence piece. How do you design for emergence? You actually can. Emergence meaning things will come out of whatever you're doing that you weren't expecting that are often marvelous. And sometimes they're not. I love the spark analogy earlier, right? You want to start a spark, but a spark can start a conflagration, right? That's the challenge. So do we need blueprints at all to get there? I want us to make sure we're asking that question. And maybe that's not even the right question. Can we apply social business frameworks broadly in most industries, most geographies, and corporate cultures? I work with corporations that are intensely private. Social is really hard for them. I work with other organizations where they're intensely public. They share everything. They're very open. The same framework would probably not work well unless it took that into account. And can we take everything into account? Every different type of industry, every geography? Financial services, which is regulated, is very different in the media business. And they know they're different, and they expect something different. So I can present a framework that would work fantastic for a bank, but it won't work so well for another type of organization, right? So will they work most of the time? So how do we get lessons learned if we're all so different? Right? This is one of our challenges, the questions that we have. And what are we going to get if we try and use it, try and squeeze some plan or some blueprint into what we do? Will we get a lower risk, faster and better results, outcomes we weren't expecting? I hope so. And is there any evidence of this? Thanks, Dion. And do they lock us into only what has happened before? Right, so you're trying to do social customer care, or you're trying to drive better collaborative outcomes among distributed groups, right? Those are the use cases we hear a lot. You're locking yourself into just that outcome, that return. That's part of the challenge. Am I using the right one here? That's all right. No, I can't. One moment here. I can't seem to advance the slides at all now.
Destroyed everything, so.
Yep, yep. Aha. Okay. We're back. So we're also in an environment where we've done this now for 5 to 7 years in most of our organizations, and we've learned some really good things, as I alluded to. And one is we're really starting to listen in a way we haven't before. Inside our organizations too, but it is amazing how now that companies have the ability to tap into what everyone else is saying about them and about anything that's relevant to them, they still generally don't listen, right? Some do, and we're starting to build that capability. So any framework should have that, take that into account. And we're learning to filter and find, now that we do have so much information, right? And I've noticed that many of the enterprise social network products have much better smart filtering and special features to be able to control what you're listening to, what you aren't listening to, to make it relevant to your work, because they know there's now too much information for you to filter and find. Analyzing for opportunities, because most of the ingenuity and the work is out there, right? It's outside your team, outside your department, elsewhere in the organization, and there's even more of it, and much more of it, outside your organization. And they represent so many opportunities. We had a workshop on social business leadership on Monday, and we talked about great examples. I used to go into financial services, for example. We were one of the very first adopters of social. And I went to this one, I showed this big list of the social networks, hundreds of them that were out there. And I told them all these conversations, important conversations about you were happening there. And they're like, yeah, no, we just don't care about that. We don't believe it, for one thing. And it was one of my few instances of perfect karma where I was able to go and, while the meeting went on, I looked up and found a discussion in the Motley Fool Forum, which is a very popular financial community. It's the #1 financial community, online community in the United States. And somebody was talking, one of their customers was asking other people where they could move their 401k, their retirement fund. They had a $50 million fund. They wanted to move away from this company I was meeting with. And I showed them right there. I said, this is what's happening out there. This is an opportunity, and you need to know about it. And every organization has thousands of such things that happen inside and outside, and we never were able to tap into it before and make much of it. And we're still not looking, for the most part, for those opportunities that are now readily visible. Right? We can spot right there on the ground, like a 100-euro note. So why aren't we picking them up? Frameworks might tell us to make sure that we do that. Where should we be listening? How should we be doing it? The great example of T-Mobile USA, they began to notice that literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of their customers were talking about leaving them, getting an iPhone. They didn't have the iPhone at the time. And then they went through this whole progression of saying, I'm going to leave, my contract is up. I'm about to go, my contract is up next week. I'm going to the store tonight. Here's a picture of my new iPhone, and I've left T-Mobile. I saw this whole thing happening, the same conversations happening over and over and over again. And so they connected their own database, tried to identify who these people were as they entered that progression, and they would contact them saying, we hear you. We know you're unhappy, and we don't want you to leave. What is it going to do to stay? And they were able to cut customer defections in half in 90 days because they were listening, right? They were looking for opportunities, and they were doing something about it. And it changed they were in a lot of trouble in the United States. It's a great corporate turnaround story because of everything we're talking about here. Listening and engaging, right, in scale. And how they did that, it's a big story. There's 33 million customer records they had to correlate to see who these people were. We learned that we can't do it all ourselves. In fact, you can't scale into social business using staff. Your social business team is never going to be big enough, not even close. You're greatly outnumbered by the size of the network, no matter what, even if it's just inside or outside. And so we don't have a good name for it, and advocates is not my favorite, but it's what the industry is starting to use. And that says we can understand who all of these other entities on the network are that believe in what we're doing and want to help. We can enlist them. There's great stories now emerging. In fact, we're starting to track who has big advocate programs. For example, Fidelity Investments in the United States. Their CEO is proud to say, because he encourages it all the time throughout the company, 28,000 advocates. This is a highly regulated company. I'd be very concerned, and these people have to be aligned to spread the company's ideas and their message. It's a great story. You see the same thing, Sprint, a big carrier in the United States. They have a Ninjas program where you can go and you can participate and be an advocate for the company. Again, it's not my favorite choice of word. And the target is they need 8,000 to be able to do the things they want to regularly do to make sure that they have a more symmetrical, that they're scaled into to be able to deal with the whole world. How does a company talk to the whole world and engage with the whole world? Through social tools, because if you start talking to them, they all talk back. Same thing with your business processes inside. You start using social tools and you work out loud, we'll talk about that in just a minute, and everyone wants to get into your business. They want to get into your business process if they think that they're a stakeholder. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing, but how do you make that scale? That's what we're trying to learn. This is my framework for social business transformation, right? Based on everything that I've seen that works, right? All across your business and with culture change, executive leadership, building and defining goals and a roadmap, redesigning your business processes to be social, managing risk, which is very hard to say. As soon as you say risk, that's all anyone wants to talk about, right? But we now see organizations are doing this at a top level. And they want, guess what? That's what they want. So, well, what has been done before? Do other frameworks for making this happen? We've seen social media centers of excellence being founded by more and more organizations going, who owns social? We don't have a social media department, right? Is it a top order function? It doesn't belong in IT, it doesn't belong in sales, it doesn't belong in HR, corporate comm. Who's responsible for making this happen? And so we're now finally creating this new entity. We see this and it actually started helping organizations design these. It's one of the number one things that we're now seeing our organizations doing is saying we need to better organize for this if we're ever going to get somewhere that's meaningful. We already talked about processes that are scaled, right? We need organizational structures for scaling the working out loud process. We don't really know how to do that because remember, none of this was designed for us really. And by us, I mean businesses. This is designed as a much better way for regular people to communicate with each other with a lot less friction, a lot more easily, and with a lot more people, right? The internet eventually took 15 years for the internet to figure out the best way to do that. And now we're trying to figure out how to make that happen. What do we do when you actually work this way? If you do work with social media, what does that look like? And have we trained everyone how to do that? All right, that's the question. You got to close the loop. Organizations are learning that now. You have all of this knowledge and all of this engagement, but if you shouldn't do anything with it, what's the point, right, if it isn't directed? And you have to disrupt the competition along the way. Why, you know, and the reason you have to do this is that we see that industries become infected with social business, if you will. And it's usually a leading company, right? Whoever one of the leaders in that industry is really successful. Then you got about 2 years before every other company starts to catch up with you. You got 2 years to really use those double-digit gains to do something interesting. So, do we need frameworks to reach the next generation organization? And if so, do we have what we need today? And let's define what a framework is, by the way, because my background's also enterprise architecture. I've done a lot of frameworks, and I know exactly what they are supposed to be. And that is a pre-built approach with holes cut out for you to pour in the details of your business. It says, hey, all of these pieces fit together. This plan all fits together, and it's everything you need to do. But of course, you're going to have to stick what's specific about your business inside of it. In theory, that's what it should do. And we have a problem with frameworks, though, is the corporate not invented here syndrome. The companies want to know what everyone else is doing, but they don't want to do what anyone else is doing, right? Because they're special. And sometimes, indeed, they are. And so this is the challenge. This is getting the whole social business story, is I still hear all the time from change champions trying to move their organizations forward, is how can I get the senior leadership to listen that this is important, right? Well, they're listening now. I mean, the data is so, I mean, we see this now in Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Management Review and everything about what kind of results people are seeing. And there have been frameworks from the start. I encourage you to go to Google Images and type in social business or enterprise 2.0 framework, and how many will come through. Every consulting company has one now. Many companies and practitioners have documented theirs. And they all have similar components, but they all might look very different. Right, here's one with all the pieces. That's something more along the lines that I might create. Here's one that we actually use. This is anonymized from a client, where we actually designed a large center of excellence for them. Here's an adoption framework, because that's all we focused on 3 years ago. 4 years ago was adoption. We need to get people to use these. Now we're using them. That's not the problem. Now we need to get something to happen with them, and often we are. Probably the leading framework that's kind of captured everyone's imagination, because it's non-technical, it's really human-centric, which I think it should be. And that's Dave Gray's concepts around podularity, right? That he began to see that really successful organizations that were network-led and adopting these things well were creating these self-organizing entities, right? The businesses within a business, right? All based on the network. And they need some kind of platform to enable them, right? Social networks or whatever, right? You can be a social business without social technology. It's just kind of weird, but it does happen, right? There are examples. This is my operational view. Here's everything you better be sure you're doing. Check it off the list. You're going to have to do it, even if it's in a very lightweight way. You can't get away with not doing any of this stuff now. And the same thing with architecture. And what's really apparent, though, is that there's so many subspecialties in what we're doing. This is Rachel Hoppe's community maturity model, right? Just to understand, what's the framework for things like community management. There's also a technical approach. What's interesting is that social business is a non-technical discipline for the most part. And that's mostly a good thing, right? This should be about people and about communities, and about how we're changing ourselves and how we're changing our organizations to work much better, right? And get the engagement we're looking for. But the IT world realized that there's many really important things we have to have. I'm a board member of the Open Social Foundation, because I see one flaw of having non-technical people leading some of these things is you don't understand all the really hard lessons we learned over the last 20 years about making network systems work. And that's led to an intense amount of social fragmentation in our organizations. There's a community for everything. There's a social network for everything. Every application has social features. A few of them are connected together. Facebook's been really good about being everywhere, but bringing it all back into one place. Our organizations are really bad at that. There's two things that kill conversation, kill engagement, right? Scale actually kills conversation and engagement. So you have to protect it. And you do have to create groups so that like minds can come together. Birds of a feather come together. And fragmentation kills conversation because you can't find each other. You're all off in your own tools, your own communities, your own social silos. We didn't actually, so one thing that email, for example, does a lot better, right? Every email system all talks to every other email system, or it doesn't work. And we forgot that lesson, and because we're not, most of us are not technical practitioners. So that's also missing, is that technical view. And that was an example of why it's so important. I do think everyone, when I say, well, social silos and fragmentation are actually becoming a huge problem now that social's everywhere, almost everyone would agree with that. But can we do a DNA transplant, right, even if we had that framework in our hands, right, because that's what we're talking about. And I would say that, and I would say, having tried to use frameworks and define them, they're not always the best approach. In fact, when we tried to codify what is important, what you absolutely must do, because if I give you the 200 to 400 things, the steps you need to do to become a social business, you'll get lost in the details very quickly and forget what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so heuristics are often much better. We boiled everything you absolutely must do. If you do it, it won't be perfect, because it never is, but you'll be okay. And our 10 tenets of social business, right? In rough order of importance, by the way, with number 1 being, it won't work unless everyone can participate. That's where the value comes from. So that might be a better approach, because we can't forget what makes social special, what makes the network special, right? Where communities lead open business processes, right? We have highly emergent and very self-organizing outcomes. We have more transparency, meaning a lot more available knowledge. Everything from the Arab Spring can happen all the way down to, there's a great example of called Fold It, which is the AIDS community built a social game that allowed problem solvers around the world to solve a problem in 10 days. Really important to resolving the AIDS epidemic, the AIDS crisis. There have been a problem for 10 years. They solved it in just 10 days. Better engagement everywhere and high scale. What we're learning is everything about social is about big numbers. You suddenly realize hey, I'm connected to everybody. And it's great because now I'm connected to everybody. What can I do with that? But it's also, how can I manage that, right? So we do see, if I look at all those frameworks, and there's many others, we can't actually spend much time this afternoon looking at them. That's homework for you to do. We do see some broad trends, but for the ones that seem to be, that resonate the most, if we look at what people actually do when they try and roll this out, using some kind of plan, is we see a high level of decentralization. Any plan that works, I think Peter was making that point, is that we all have to change our organizations. User control. There's this big shift away from top-down control to things like pods, for example, but just to the edge of the network, right? And that's the only way we can cope with the other problem, which is need to deal with constant change, right? It's almost constant. In fact, the outside world is pulling away from most organizations. It's changing faster. And that can only happen for so long, right? The organizations that are falling behind slower are doing well. Has adaptive processes as a result of that, and a lot of local autonomy. It's very hard for anything, a plan, a blueprint, a framework, to be one size fits all. It needs to be adapted. And it needs to be adapted to the local environment. And that way you don't have to figure out, hey, what's my local culture, or corporate culture, what's my local geography, all of that. That's just part of the plan, is to make this work here. And then sustainable transformation. The plan has to change too. It has to continue to change, right? There's just, in the middle of this is the only important thing to take away. There's this infinite process of growth, refinement, disruption, and renewal that we need to embody and enable. There is one place where frameworks are really happening that is encouraging, and that's in functional areas. So when we see organizations saying, I need to do customer care, what's a good operating plan for that? And you can find a pretty simple blueprint for doing really good customer care. There's lots of examples of that, and people can do it. Same thing with supply chain management, project management, customer care, innovation, community management, advocacy. All of these functions now have relatively well-defined, if not frameworks. There's lots of really good information and, again, blueprints that you can pull from. And so what we see is a framework of frameworks seems to be the most successful at a functional level, saying I need to do this new network-centric thing over here and then plug it into my overall plan, right? That seems to be what's happening. And so in the end, what most organizations need is guidance and a way to cross-check their journey. There's many ways to do that. That's why you're here. I love the examples. We need to, I think, codify them a little bit better. We want to build on the shoulders of those that came before us. and we want to make sure we haven't forgotten anything. And so even today, if you look around, even with all this talk of frameworks, what most organizations are doing is building their own, right? And they're relatively informal. Not always. We come across companies that have a very systematized process, but they do it. The organizations that are successful do it with their community, right? They say, look, we're going to need you guys to actually do this because that's what this is about, right? It's about decentralized, distributed, open, participative change. And so that, in a nutshell, is kind of what we learned. You know, we've been doing this now for nearly a decade in some cases, and how we're starting to think about codifying it. And I don't think the binderware and the rigorous frameworks of years past are going to work, but we do need a way of codifying, and that is starting to happen. And again, the evidence appears to be that functional frameworks of some kind are probably the best place to focus for your given organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Dion. So there's light at the end of the tunnel.
I think so. I mean, I think it was just much scarier when we didn't know what this was really going to take us. And we're seeing the highest level of maturity, obviously, that we've ever seen. I hear all the numbers now. We have tens of thousands of users, and they've created hundreds or thousands of groups. And it's hard work, and I have to continually keep pushing an organization, but we're seeing steady progress.
For me, I always distinguish between the adoption of the technology and the change around this, and then the further transformation of the whole business, because I don't see any movement that could do from zero to the new social enterprise designed model in one step. So I would always say, well, it's always adopting first and change around that you can use the technology, and certainly change also some corporate behavior habits, but not really transforming the business model. And transforming the business model is the second step. So would you say that your framework is including this as well?
Yes, I think very much it is including it. What we don't have is good management theory to back up what these social tools should do in our organizations. And I would note that most companies realize they need the technology to do this, so it very quickly becomes, all right, we can buy this, right? We can buy a tool to make this happen. And it's much easier to add something to your organization than to change what someone is already doing, right? So to say, we're going to change the whole organization is much harder than we're going to add something to the organization. So buying social tools and setting them free inside the organization seems like the best step for both of those reasons. And I think that's what we're going to tend to see. And then our business models and our management concepts have to be updated. And I think we do need to have contact with that technology so we can even figure out what those answers are. So I think that it's inevitable that it's going to happen in that order. And I think that it's also generally a good thing, but you can be certainly far too technology-centric when doing this.
Are there any questions? Yes.
Hi, Dion. I've got a question, and I think it's something that we seem to ignore, and I think is critical, which is going back to the fragmentation of the social networking efforts. I want you to comment, if you can, on what the W3C organization is doing in terms of those social business standards that they're supposed to be working for the last 4 or 5 years, and nothing seems to come through. And I agree with you that fragmentation is breaking the conversation into silos that we don't seem to know how to break.
So there's nothing worse than producing a standard prematurely before we know what we actually need. The standards world learned that the hard way. It's easy to do foundational things like HTML and HTTP because if there's nothing at all, then it's easy to define something. We lucked out that on the 4th or 5th try, because remember, the web is not the first thing that happened on the internet. It was, again, the 4th or 5th major thing, and it was the big one, right? And it hit upon the right set of standards. We've learned the same thing about social. There's been so many attempts at creating standardization around it, and almost all of them have fallen by the wayside. Open social is one of the few that have survived, and again, only in the enterprise world, right? And there's activity streams and others. It's not that important that we know the details of those, but we do need to know which ones there are. Most of our enterprise social networks support these, by the way. Things like Open Social, which allow us to connect all these things together. So The W3C and the Open Social Foundation have joined forces because we're starting to get a better sense. There's this kind of feeling that we're kind of now understanding where all of this is settling, right? And it might be time to synthesize a standard that codifies what seems to actually be happening. But that is a highly political process involving a lot of collaboration. And sometimes collaboration is timely and messy. So I expect it's still going to be another year or two before we see anything.
Are you involved with it?
Yes.
Why there isn't enough transparency that the general public who are pushing for this social business gets more information about what's going on, even if political?
I think it's just there's probably not enough investment in for example, every year there is a social business jam online. IBM actually sponsors it every year where we get even Tim Berners-Lee himself, the guy that invented the internet, is in there trying to talk to everyone saying, what do you guys think that we should be doing? It just doesn't have the visibility. And I just don't see, again, it's something that us nerds really are interested in much more than in most people who just want to get work done. So there's just not a lot of consumer interest, I find.
Thanks.
Any more questions?
Connecting on that question about standards, do you think that business schools should be starting or at least thinking about implementing social business tactics? Because I heard a couple of times in the past few days that they're really just still training people how to use a spreadsheet, and that's really something that we don't want to do anymore. How do you feel about that?
Very well said. So we touched on this at last year's conference here in Paris, and that is just like we had to give people digital literacy, we called it computer literacy way back in the day. We need social business literacy now as well, because it is different than social media, right? There's a lot of similarities and much of the same technology and same ideas, but it is slightly different. Our business concerns are slightly different. How do we teach people to make the most use of these new, powerful new ways of working, right? Know when to create a community and when to enlist an existing one, and how to have the greatest impact and how to build social capital. I don't think these are MBA level programs. I think these are much more, or a combination, I think, of workman-like, training, and then for people whose job responsibility is then, literally all the way up to degree programs and, network centricity. So yes, we need to do all of that if we're expecting to get results out of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.